Hello, this is Chris Rodriguez, and welcome to the National Resource Center's Understanding ABLE Program Disclosure Documents webinar. Before we get started, I would just like to go over some housekeeping slides real quick. The audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure your speakers are turned on and your headphones are plugged in. You can control the audio broadcast via the audio broadcast panel. If you accidentally close the panel, you can reopen it by going to the Communicate menu at the top of the screen and choosing Join Audio Broadcast. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or would prefer to listen by phone, you can dial the number provided on the right hand of your screen. Real-time captioning is provided during this webinar. The captions can be found in Media Viewer Panel, which appears in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar platform. If you would like to make the Media Viewer Panel larger, you can minimize other panels such as chat, Q&A, and/or participants. In terms of submitting questions, please use the Q&A box to submit any questions you have during the webinar, and we will direct those questions accordingly during the Q&A portion. If you are listening by phone and have not logged into the webinar, you may also ask questions by emailing questions to kauchenbach@ndi-inc.org. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the ABLE National Center website at the following web link. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send a message to the host NDI admin, or you can also email kauchenbach@ndi-inc.org. Okay, we are very excited to have another list of extraordinary panelists and presenters today. Again, my name is Chris Rodriguez. I'm the director of the ABLE National Resource Center, and we'll be doing the first part of the presentation. But I'm also joined by Celia Olgan, who is the Assistant General Counsel for the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, who will be giving a presentation on the MSRB and their role within ABLE. Also, we have guest panelists that can provide their expertise and information related to this topic and ABLE in general. That includes Michael Morris, Executive Director of National Disability Institute, Juliana Chris, Director of the Ohio Stable Accounts Program, and Daniel Elkis, who is our in-house ABLE account owner. So we have a pretty packed agenda today. We're going to start off by giving our generic information related to ABLE history and ABLE basics. We want to make sure that everybody has a fairly broad foundation so that everybody can fully appreciate the more in-depth information that we'll be getting into later, which is the ABLE disclosure documents discussion. We're going to talk about what a disclosure document is and why they are important. We're going to discuss where you can find a state's ABLE program disclosure document in general. We're going to talk about what types of information should you be looking for when looking through an ABLE program disclosure document. And we're also going to be talking about how one ABLE program disclosure document might be different from another state's ABLE disclosure document and why that is. After we finish that up, we're going to have the presentation from MSRB, which is going to discuss giving us an introduction into what exactly the MSRB is and what they do, and more specifically what their role is in the ABLE sphere. At the end of that, we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for some Q&A. We'll bring in our guest panelists to give their perspective on the topic, and we'll also be answering as many questions as we can from our audience. So please feel free to use that Q&A box. We're going to be collecting those over the next hour and then hopefully addressing as many of those as possible. So let's go ahead and get started with a little ABLE history. So what is ABLE? Well, ABLE is the Stephen Beck Jr. Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, and what it does is it amends the federal tax code and adds what's called Section 529A. And what that does is it creates a new option for eligible people with disabilities to save money in a tax-exempt account that may be used for qualified disability expenses, and all at the same time not putting into jeopardy their eligibility for federal public benefits. And you notice we highlighted or we underlined certain terms that I just used there. We're going to break those down and help you understand what those mean exactly here in a little bit. ABLE became law in December of 2014 after nearly a decade of bipartisan support, of which culminated in 85% of the entire U.S. Congress supporting the ABLE Act. And as many of you probably know, I think that's a complete testament to just the value and the immense importance of the benefits of ABLE. It's also important to note that this federal legislation authorizes but does not require states to establish ABLE accounts. So that might be why you're going to notice that there aren't 50 ABLE programs, but in fact currently there are 32 states that have established it. There's no requirement to establish it, but these states have seen such value and such need for the benefits that are provided through ABLE that over 40 have actually already passed ABLE-related legislation in their state so that they can then move forward on launching their programs. Let's talk a little bit about the ABLE basics. So these are going to be characteristics that by and large are going to be consistent across all programs, no matter if you're in the Ohio program or the Florida program or the Virginia program or the Oregon program. These are things that are based in federal law that should be consistent across every single program. So, some of the basic characteristics. Well, there are eligibility requirements related to opening an ABLE account that speak to, number one, the age in which the individual first experienced his or her disability, and number two, related to the severity of that disability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Also, an eligible individual is not obligated to enroll in their state of residence. Now, this was the case previously when the original law was passed, but that was amended about a year later to allow, let's say, if you live in the state of Texas and you meet the eligibility criteria, you can still enroll in another state's ABLE program, again, provided that you meet the eligibility criteria. Additionally, the designated beneficiary is the account owner. That's very important. This is one of the differentiating factors or characteristics among ABLE accounts, say when compared to something like a third-party special needs trust. The individual has a lot more autonomy and control and independence over these funds themselves as perhaps they would if they had a third-party special needs trust. That being said, if the designated beneficiary, who is the person with a disability, either does not have the capacity to oversee that account, or if for whatever reason they just would like some help with it, there are three types of individuals that can have what's called signature authority, which basically allows them oversight of the account on behalf of the person with the disability. And that would include a parent of the designated beneficiary, a guardian of the designated beneficiary, or a person with power of attorney. But if you're not one of those three types of individuals, then you would not be able to exercise authority on behalf of the designated beneficiary over their ABLE account. Also, funds in an ABLE account may be used for what's called qualified disability-related expenses, and we'll talk about what those expenses are and what the definition of that term is in a few slides as well. Additionally, assets in and distributions for qualified disability-related expenses will be disregarded or given special treatment when determining eligibility for most federal means-tested benefits, including Social Security benefits and Medicaid. And you'll notice that I use the term most federal means-tested benefits as opposed to all, because there is one exception, and we'll talk about that as well. Additionally, multiple individuals can contribute into a person's ABLE account, including friends, families, perhaps an employer, and certainly, not to be overlooked, the beneficiary themselves can contribute into their own ABLE account, perhaps as a result of employment or something like that. Currently, there is a $15,000 annual contribution limit into a person's ABLE account. So this means that all contributors combined in any given tax year can only contribute up to $15,000. Now, there may be an exception to that, provided that the individual has employment, but we can talk about that a little later, and that's a change that has recently happened, and ABLE programs are in the process of implementing that. But for now, what's important to know is that there is an annual contribution limit and that it's currently set at $15,000 and that that's all contributors combined. Okay, let's talk very quickly about who exactly is eligible. Is every person with a disability eligible? Unfortunately not. There is eligibility criteria in order to be allowed to open an account. And again, those are broken down into two different kind of prongs. The first states that in order to be eligible to open up an ABLE account, the individual must have first experienced or had an onset of their disability before their 26th birthday. So, as an example, if you're an individual, let's say like my brother, who's an ABLE account owner who lives down in Texas, he has had significant intellectual and developmental disabilities since birth, so obviously he would meet that criteria. Now let's take another individual who perhaps is 27 years of age and had the unfortunate circumstance of getting into a bad car accident, leaving them unable to use their arms and legs. While they would certainly meet the definition of disability and even the severity of disability that we're about to talk about, since that accident happened after their 26th birthday, they unfortunately would not be eligible. It would not meet the criteria related to the age requirement. So let's say that you do meet the age criteria. There is a second prong that you must meet, and that relates to the severity of the disability. So you can meet that in one of two ways. The first, you could have been determined to meet the disability requirements for supplemental security income or Social Security disability benefits and are receiving those benefits. So that basically means that you are currently a recipient, a beneficiary of either SSI or SSDI, and that disability occurred or you had an onset of that disability prior to your 26th birthday, then you're good to go. You're able to open up your ABLE account. Let's say that you meet the age criteria, but for whatever reason you are not currently a beneficiary of SSI or SSDI, you may still be able to open up an ABLE account, but you would have to submit what's called a disability certification. Actually, you don't actually have to submit it. I'm going to correct myself there, but you would have to receive a disability certification assuring that the individual holds documentation from a physician's office, from a physician, that includes a diagnosis and that physician's signature and confirms that the individual meets the functional disability criteria that's articulated within the ABLE Act. It's important to note that you actually would keep those in your own records and only have to submit them if asked to by either the state ABLE program, of which they are not asking for that information, but you would have to sign under penalty of perjury that it does exist and you have it, or perhaps the IRS or the Treasury, if ever audited, might request information like that, but you keep that in your own records and submit it if requested to. So now that we understand a little bit about who is eligible, let's talk about what these funds can be used for. And again, we said previously that the funds can be used for what's called qualified disability expenses, but what exactly does that mean? Well, qualified disability expenses, or QDEs, as they're sometimes referred to, are expenses that relate to the designated beneficiary's blindness or disability and are for the benefit of that designated beneficiary in helping them maintain or increase their health, independence, or quality of life. And as you can imagine, that is an extremely broad definition of what these funds can be used for. And we wanted to encourage Congress and encourage Treasury, who's the ones that are overseeing this program ultimately, to provide for a broad definition, because we appreciate the various needs and the spectrum of the needs of people with disabilities, especially those with such severe disabilities that would allow them eligibility to open an ABLE account. Additionally, the term qualified disability expenses is stated that it should be broadly construed to permit even the inclusion of things like basic living expenses, and that it should not be limited to expenses of which there is a medical necessity or which provide no benefit to others in addition to the benefit to the eligible individual. So Congress also provided just kind of what I like to call buckets or categories in which these qualified disability expenses might fall under. And you'll see there, again, it's very extensive. Includes education, housing, transportation, employment training and supports, assistive technology, personal support services, health, prevention and wellness, financial management and administrative services, legal fees, and even includes funeral and burial expenses. And again, goes so far as to also include basic living expenses. So again, very, very broad in terms of what these funds can be used for. However, it is also important to note that distributions for non-qualified expenditures will be subject to tax penalties and consequences, and in fact, perhaps maybe even more importantly to note, they could affect the individual's eligibility for their federally means-tested benefits such as supplemental security income, SSI, or even Medicaid. So it's important to understand that while Congress and while the rules that oversee the implementation and how these accounts work provide for an extremely broad definition of what they can be used for, it's important to note that if they are misused, there are significant consequences. Okay. So, how does an ABLE account how do ABLE account assets impact eligibility for federal benefits? So this is what really, at least to me, makes ABLE so special, is the fact that ABLE assets, or funds contributed into an ABLE account that are sitting there, will be disregarded or receive favorable treatment when determining eligibility for most federal means-tested benefits. Now, why this is so important is because historically, individuals with disabilities that are receiving, say, supports and services through a program such as Medicaid have had resource limits, meaning that they could only save the very modest of resources before their eligibility would be put in jeopardy. In fact, in many circumstances, they are not allowed to save more than $2,000 at any given time worth of assets, or else they could risk losing those very vital and important supports and services, essential supports and services provided through a Medicaid program. Now, this allows individuals to save significant amounts of money without having to worry about that. But there is one exception, and that relates to ABLE account owners who are also receiving SSI, or supplemental security income. And what the law says is, in this particular case, when the account goes over $100,000, that the cash benefit associated with being an SSI beneficiary will be temporarily suspended until such time as the account falls back below $100,000. So that's important to note for SSI beneficiaries who have been putting money away in these ABLE accounts to the extent in which they could exceed $100,000. They will have to make a decision as to whether or not they want to make sure that the account remains below $100,000, whether that means purchasing a qualified disability expense or closing down the account in terms of contribution, additional contributions, or if they would like to have their cash benefit temporarily suspended and try and make up for that with the funds in their ABLE account. Now, of course, you know, as we'll learn here in a little bit from Juliana, who's our expert panelist from Ohio, they launched the first program, and it's been up no longer than 2 years, coming up on 2 years in June, and at $14,000 or $15,000 a year now as the annual contribution limit. Obviously, nobody has approached $100,000 yet, but it's still important for folks to understand that. And it's also important to note that if you're not receiving SSI, then you can completely disregard that. And in that circumstance, I would say that all federal means-tested benefits programs will not take into consideration funds in this account. Again, I just want to kind of make this bold and kind of underline the fact that even if your account breaches $100,000 and your SSI cash benefit is suspended, your Medicaid benefit will not be touched. And that's very important to note because many individuals access Medicaid by way of their eligibility for SSI. So I know that there's often a lot of questions around that. One other aspect that I know that we wanted to make sure that people understand, and it's actually related to Medicaid, is a provision called the Medicaid Payback provision that's included in the ABLE law. And this states that any assets remaining in an ABLE account when a beneficiary passes away, subject to outstanding qualified disability expenses, which could include funeral and burial expenses, can be used to reimburse a state for Medicaid payments made on behalf of that beneficiary, starting at the point in which that individual created their ABLE account. Now that's important to know, but also it's important to note that some states have passed state legislation to disallow their state, which is providing those Medicaid benefits to the ABLE account owner, to file that claim. So some states have actually gotten around to it. Very few so far have gotten around that provision, but some have. So we often say that, ABLE is one tool in a toolbox of many that can help people with disabilities have a brighter financial future and be able to save without jeopardizing their benefits. And it's really a tool to get around the asset limits, but it's perhaps not the best tool if you're thinking about wealth transfer and things like that. Maybe you would want to look at a special needs trust if you had, if those considerations were something that was extremely important to you. It's worth noting also, though, that there's no reason why you can't have both a special needs trust and an ABLE account, and we would often argue that the benefits provided by having both of those outweigh having either one individually. As I said previously, over the last about year and a half or about 18 months, starting with the state of Ohio having launched the first ABLE program in June of 2015, we have seen 32 states plus DC launch ABLE programs. The vast majority of them are enrolling eligible individuals nationwide, meaning no matter where you live, you can enroll in those programs. However, there are some states that have decided to have in-state only programs, meaning that in addition to meeting the eligibility that we talked about today, you would also have to be a resident of that particular state to enroll into their program. Okay, now that everybody has kind of a general understanding of ABLE, we want to talk about what the primary topic is of this webinar, and that's understanding ABLE disclosure documents. And while disclosure documents often are not the most exciting topics, in this circumstance, they are very important to understand what they are, where to find them, how to read them, what to look for in them, because individuals with disabilities and the account owners of the ABLE accounts need to fully understand the ins and outs of this program in order to be able to fully benefit from them and to not end up in a position where their benefits might be in jeopardy. So let's talk a little bit about these. So what is a disclosure document and why are they important? Well, a disclosure document as it relates to ABLE shares information about each individual state ABLE program, of which we just saw there's over 32 programs out there, and while I would venture to say maybe 80% of the characteristics from ABLE program to other ABLE programs are consistent across all programs, there are significant differences, and these disclosure documents will detail what those differences are in great detail and help the individual, or the purpose is to help the individual fully understand kind of what they're getting themselves into as an ABLE account owner and how to best manage those within the confines of the law. Additionally, these documents help ABLE account owners and potential account owners understand the purpose of each state ABLE program, the program's eligibility requirements, their benefits, information about investment choices, plan terms and conditions, costs, risks, and other important legal information are all going to be outlined in this document. Additionally, disclosure documents are are important so account owners understand, again, eligibility requirements related not only to what we talked about, but any additional eligibility requirements that might be specific to that state program, such as whether or not the individual has to be an in-state or can be an out-of-state resident, benefits, cost, and risk associated with opening up an ABLE account and using ABLE account funds. It's important to note, and this is very well documented within these disclosure documents, that while we describe these ABLE accounts as savings accounts, what they really are is they're investment accounts, and these investment accounts come with risk, and that risk is detailed within these documents, and it's important to understand how those investments, what they look like, how they perform, and how they may perform, and looking at those through the lens of what that particular ABLE account owner might want to be using these accounts for. Additionally, information in these documents can help ABLE account owners choose the program which best helps them achieve their specific goals and helps them maximize program benefits and avoid penalties and consequences such as loss of government benefits or increased tax liability for improper use of the funds. So again, these documents are going to help folks differentiate one program from another. As an example, there are fees associated with these programs, both in terms of the investment side of them and the maintenance side of them, and they can be different from one program to another, and that will be detailed in these documents. So you can hold these documents up, one program next to another, and fully understand and better appreciate which program best meets your needs depending on how you want to exercise the use of your ABLE program. Okay, so what types of information should you expect in an ABLE disclosure document? So it's important to understand what types of information might be included, because if you don't go into this understanding what you're looking for, they can at times be a little overwhelming. So readers can expect to find introductory information about the structure and purpose of ABLE accounts in general, so they'll be oftentimes giving you a little history, some of the stuff that we discussed earlier on. You can also expect to find information outlining, again, eligibility requirements for eligibility related to SSI beneficiaries and those seeking eligibility via the disability certification document, our certification process that we talked about earlier. They're going to talk about who exactly is eligible and the different avenues in which one might be eligible to open up an account. They're going to talk about and they're going to provide information about how and when to contribute to an ABLE account, and annual and lifetime contribution limits are also found in these ABLE accounts. And that's another point to make. While that contribution limit that we talked about with respect to the annual contribution limit, currently set at $15,000, that'll be consistent across all programs. But there's additionally a cumulative and overall account limit that differs from program to program, and that's going to be stipulated within these disclosure documents, so that again you can do some comparison there to figure out which one best meets your needs. In terms of how to open the account, it'll explain how to do that. A lot of people don't know or are confused by the fact that you actually don't go into a brick and mortar bank and open up these accounts. It's actually all done online, and that's detailed in these disclosure documents. Additionally, these documents have explanations related to, again, what is a qualified disability expense versus a non-qualified expense, and what are the what exactly are the penalties if these accounts are misused. So all that is going to be in there. It's going to detail also situations in which rollovers are allowable. So all the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of these programs, not only the programs in general, but specifically that program that you're looking at, are all going to be within this particular document. Again, you know, it also talks about not only what we talked about in terms of how these accounts are not taken into consideration, or how they're taken into consideration with respect to federal benefits programs, but also many states have state means tested benefits, and many of these disclosure documents will talk about that as well, or give advice or direction on those. So a lot of information, much more than we could ever hope to provide in a single webinar, are provided within these documents, which is why these documents are so incredibly important. Additionally, these documents may also address the wide range of different investment options. Again, this is something that I talked about a couple slides ago, that it's incredibly important, and I know this is an area of certain apprehension when signing up for these programs, is fully understanding what investment options are, what are the fees associated with different investment options, how many investment options do I have. All that is going to be detailed in a manner that should hopefully make the person who's interested in opening up the ABLE account or who already has one more comfortable with getting involved, because they better understand every aspect, not the least of which are the investment options. Also, ABLE disclosure documents outline risk associated with the ABLE account, again, such as contributions, possible impact on, again, eligibility for benefits, both not only on the federal level, but again on the state level in certain circumstances. And again, it outlines the risk associated with the investment options, which is, again, hopefully many of you have been on the other webinars that focus specifically on investment options, but it's important to note that those options can be different depending on one program to another program, and that all that information is detailed within these documents. Another important thing to notice or to look for in these documents are additional tax incentives related to that specific program. While there are no deductions provided on the federal level for contributions made into an ABLE account, there may be state income tax deductions or credits provided depending on which program you're in, and that information will be divulged in these documents. Let's see here. And lastly, and something that I think is maybe most user-friendly, if you can use that term, for these types of documents, is the fact that many of them, and hopefully we can learn a little bit more about them later, actually have tables showing hypothetical situations related to fees, so that a person not only understands what they're getting themselves into in that moment, but how those fees might build up over time depending on the investment option that they choose. And they're usually provided in a fairly clear type of table depending on contributions and things like that. So that's another thing that I think is extremely helpful, that's really only going to be found within those disclosure documents. And that's really the only place that you can find those. So we've taken a little bit of time to talk about all the in-depth information that can really only be found within these documents. But we also want to help folks out with, well, where exactly can I find this disclosure document, right? So I understand what information is in it, but where can I locate it? Well, a disclosure document is typically located on the website of the state ABLE program at the bottom of their home page, and typically can be found by clicking on a button that usually says Plan Disclosures or Plan Disclosure Document Links. Each program may offer, again, different fees and investment options. They're all going to be detailed in there. If you do have an issue, or if you have a problem finding that button that would take you to that program's disclosure document on their website, you can go to the ABLE National Resource Center website and click on any of the states that have launched ABLE programs. It'll take you to that state's ABLE National Resource Center page, and on that, just a few places down, has a link to that disclosure document. So if you're having a problem finding it on the state's page, please come to the ABLE National Resource Center website and we can provide it. If you'd rather go to another place, and we're going to learn more about this, you can go to the MSRB site, and they have what's called their EMA platform that we'll learn a bit more about here in a little while, that also provides by state where you can find those. So there's a number of different places to find those, and I would encourage folks, obviously, to look into those when they're examining programs. So just very quickly, before I wrap up and we learn much more about MSRB, I wanted to just provide, kind of a top 10 list of what types of information should you be looking for when reading ABLE program disclosure documents. So we kind of have what are the top 10 things to look for, right? So perhaps in no particular order, but these are just 10 things that we thought would be useful. Number one, the eligibility standards. Not only understanding things that we discussed today, but whether or not is that state an in-state or out-of-state program. Is that part of their eligibility? Two, does that state have income tax credits or deductions related to contributions made to that? Three, what are the annual and aggregate contribution limits, of which the annual should be consistent across all programs, the aggregate might be different or will most likely be different from program to program. Additionally, you're going to want to understand and read about how the ABLE account may interact with federal and state benefits. Fifth, you're going to want to understand account fees and whether they vary by state of residence. Some programs, if you're an in-state resident, you have one fee structure, and if you're an out-of-state resident, you have another fee structure related to that same program. That will all be talked about within this document. Sixth, and again, this is something we talked about throughout the last few slides, but each of these documents are going to outline the investment options and fees and whether they vary by state, of which in many circumstances they do. Seven, if the state ABLE program has a checking account or a debit card option or any fees associated with those cards, so that's a really great thing to look out for, especially if you plan to be using this ABLE account more frequently in terms of more frequent transactions. You might want to be interested in knowing more about whether or not that program offers more accessibility to those funds through something like a debit card, and the disclosure document will let you know what those are. 8, information about how ABLE funds can be used, so it's going to again detail what exactly a qualified disability expense is. 9, information about account rollovers, when that is allowed and when that's not allowed, will all be in there. And then lastly, information about the applicability of the Medicaid recovery provision or Medicaid payback provision. We talked about how some states have passed state legislation to get around that. Within the disclosure document, that's information that may be included. That will be very important. So I want to keep moving here because I want to have enough time to take questions at the end, but I did include a breakdown of each of those individual top 10 things to look for to give you an examples of what they might look like when you're reading through those documents. So we have a page, and these slides will be up on the ABLE National Resource Center within the next week, so you can take your time and go through each one of those top 10 things to look for in more specificity through these slides. But I just want to give an example here. The state income tax credits or deductions, it takes you through what those might look like. Again, how they interact with federal and state benefits, assets versus income tests are included in there. Account fees, of course, those lay down what those might look like. Again, the checking card option, the disclosure document will also show whether an ABLE program offers a debit card option that can be used to purchase items and whether that card has a fee associated with it. The disclosure document should talk about definitions related to how the money can be spent. We'll talk about, the document should talk about what is allowable in terms of a rollover and what's not allowed in terms of a rollover. It'll again talk about in greater detail the Medicaid Payback provision and whether or not that state may have already passed legislation and what that legislation says. Again, or also if you have any questions, who should you contact if you have questions about a particular disclosure document? If you have any questions, we recommend that you contact that state-specific program, of which on each of their pages there is usually a toll-free phone number, and email, and postal information provided to those. You can always request disclosure documents in print, I would think, but that's another question you can ask each individual program if you feel compelled to do so. And these are going to be very specific questions, which is why we would recommend, if you have questions about the disclosure document, to contact that specific state. Okay, with that, I want to turn it over to Celia Olgan, who is the Assistant General Counsel for the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, and she's going to give us some information about what exactly the MSRB is and what they do and how that relates to the work that we do here at the ABLE National Resource Center and how that relates to ABLE in general. So, Celia, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. So as noted, my name is Celia Olgan. I am the Assistant General Counsel at the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, or the MSRB. So what I do essentially is I perform a policy-type function where I assist in rulemaking for the entities that are regulated by the MSRB. So let's see if we can go ahead and advance the slide here. Apologies, we might be experiencing a little bit of a technical difficulty here.
Celia, I can go ahead and advance it if you just give me a heads up.
If you wouldn't mind doing that, that would be wonderful. Okay, so
sure,
again, no worries at all. So again, as I had mentioned, I am essentially involved in the policy-making function. So what does a policy-making function related to municipal securities have to do with ABLE programs? As Chris had mentioned, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the MSRB itself first so you understand our framework and how we operate, and then we'll start to kind of bring that home a little bit with respect to ABLE programs. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, the MSRB is a congressionally created self-regulatory organization, or an SRO, and we have been around for quite some time. We are unique, however, with respect to the way that most SROs operate, because we don't actually have any type of examination or enforcement authority. How we principally go about accomplishing our mission, which is to promote a fair, transparent, and efficient municipal market and to protect investors and the public interest, is through rulemaking. That's why we have the name rulemaking in the name of our organization. So who do we create rules for? Municipal securities dealers and municipal advisors. And I'll explain a little bit more who these two regulated entities are. But we also accomplish our objective through education and outreach, including assisting the regulated entities, meaning the dealers and municipal advisors, with their compliance obligations. And in addition, we also do a substantial amount of outreach to investors in municipal securities, which could include investors in ABLE programs. Lastly, we operate a transparency program, which is what Chris had alluded to a little bit earlier, called our EMMA platform. And again, we'll also speak about that a little bit more. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit about the MSRB's governance. I'm not going to get too much in the details here other than to mention that the MSRB is governed by a board of directors. And you'll see here that we have a fair number of members of our board of directors. Suffice it to say that these board of directors have a substantial amount of experience in the municipal securities market and in the industry. They come from both regulated entities, including those dealers and municipal advisors, as well as public representatives who are representing principally either the issuer side, meaning this particular states, for example, that might be coming out with that might be sponsoring an ABLE program, or the investors in municipal securities, which again could potentially be interested in ABLE programs. So on the next slide, we'll do just a tad bit of a deeper dive into how the MSRB seeks to accomplish our mission. As I had mentioned, we principally promulgate rules for municipal securities dealers. And for these purposes, we can think of these as essentially being those regulated entities that are involved in the buying and selling of municipal securities. A typical example would be, let's say, if you have a particular state that's looking to finance the building of a new bridge, for example, if they're looking to finance that through, let's say, an IOU, they might issue municipal securities, and then an investor in those municipal securities would, in fact, end up getting periodic interest payments in response for their investment in that particular municipal security. We also regulate municipal advisors, and up until fairly recently, municipal advisors were typically referred to in the industry as financial advisors. Only these would be advisors to states and local entities in connection with their issuing and offering of municipal securities. it's important to note that we do not have any jurisdiction over issuers. So there's no regulation whatsoever, and there's no rulemaking with respect to states and local subdivisions. As I'd mentioned, we also try to accomplish our goal via transparency, and that is our EMMA website. EMMA stands for the Electronic Municipal Market Access Platform, and this is a free website operated by the MSRB. On this website, investors can access bond disclosure documents for virtually every municipal security. You can also access 529 Education Savings Plan and ABLE program disclosure documents, and we'll touch a bit more on that in a moment. In addition, investors can also access trade data. So we require dealers in municipal securities to report to the MSRB information about virtually every transaction in municipal securities within about 15 minutes. And so investors in municipal securities can access our website and see information about transactions in municipal securities as well as the price at which those transactions were executed. And lastly, we do conduct a substantial amount of education, and the principal way through which we go about that education is via an education center. And this is also a free center that's hosted on the MSRB's website at msrb.org. Here, investors and the industry at large can access objective multimedia education resources about the municipal securities market, including information about ABLE programs, as well as the protections that the MSRB puts into place with respect to some of these ABLE programs to the extent that there is a regulated MSRB party involved. So now we'll talk a little bit more about how all of this really relates, how the MSRB's role relates to ABLE programs. You can see in the coming slides that interest in ABLE programs are typically really only offered by direct purchase from the issuer, and that the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the principal regulator of the securities market, views those interests in ABLE programs as being sold in specifically defined primary offerings under SEC rules. So the crux of this really, you'll see on the next slide, is that interests in ABLE programs may be considered municipal securities under the federal laws. And to the extent that they are, they might also be considered municipal fund securities under MSRB rules, which is essentially a subset of municipal securities. So if these interests in ABLE programs are considered municipal securities, then MSRB rules would apply to them to the extent that there's a dealer involved or a municipal advisor involved in advising the sponsor or the state of that particular program. So we'll see on the next slide, as I mentioned before, that the MSRB's jurisdiction is limited to the activities of dealers and municipal advisors and does not extend to the issuer or to the sponsor of an ABLE program. So that means that interest in ABLE programs that are sold by state officials or employees without the involvement of an MSRB regulated entity would not be subject to MSRB rules. So what does this mean? It's unlikely that you would go in a program disclosure document and see somebody particularly identified as a dealer, for example, or as a municipal advisor. It's possible, but that's not necessarily the way that it would always occur. So they might, suffice it to know that an ABLE program manager or an affiliate of a program manager could, depending on the facts and circumstances, be an underwriter or a dealer or a municipal advisor. So again, to the extent that any of these particular individuals are involved in an ABLE program, then MSRB rules would apply. What does it mean for MSRB rules to come into play? You'll see on the next slide that we have a host of rules. Here we've only provided a select sample in the next slide of some of the rules that would apply to dealers. And I'm not going to go into depth describing all of these describing all of these rules, but I do just want to note some of the high-level aspects of some of the most applicable rules. So Rule G17 is the MSRB's fair dealing rule, and it essentially requires both dealers and municipal advisors to deal fairly with all persons in the conduct of their municipal securities activities. With respect to dealer activity, we also have a suitability rule that essentially requires dealers to ensure that any transaction or investment strategy that they recommend is suitable for the investor based on his or her investment profile. We also have an advertising rule that essentially prohibits false and misleading advertisements and sets forth advertising standards for municipal fund securities, which again could include interest in ABLE programs. Also here, I wanted to note that we do have Rule G32, which essentially requires underwriters of ABLE programs, to the extent that there is one for the program, to disclose to the MSRB certain information about the plans that they underwrite, and also to disclose to the MSRB, or rather to submit to the MSRB, plan disclosure information, so the program's plan disclosure document. And that in turn is something that we make available on our EMA website. The last rule that I wanted to mention here, I apologize, it looks like it was accidentally included on the subsequent slide, is Rule G45 regarding reporting of information on municipal fund securities. Effectively, this would require underwriters of municipal securities to report to the MSRB much more significant and substantial information about the ABLE programs to which that dealer is an underwriter, and this essentially allows the MSRB to better understand these programs in connection with our regulation of these dealers and municipal advisors. On this next slide, you see here that we also list out a handful of rules that speak to municipal advisors. I'm not going to talk so much about those other than to note that municipal advisors, again, typically are the financial advisors to those states and sponsors of the ABLE programs, and that they're also subject to a similar type of regulatory framework. So moving on now to the EMA website, which is probably the most of interest to the audience here. So as I had mentioned, the EMA website is the MSRB's electronic municipal market access website. And this is the official repository for, as I had mentioned, trade data about municipal securities, as well as disclosure information on virtually all municipal bonds. So we have here a screenshot of the MSRB's landing page on EMA for 529 college savings plans and ABLE programs. You can see here that we provide free public access to municipal market information, including ABLE program disclosure booklets, to the extent that there's a dealer or underwriter involved. It is fairly, I would hope to say, user-friendly. And so using this map-based view, you can click on a particular state, and then to the extent that we've received information or the program disclosure document for that particular ABLE program, you would be able to access it here. So it's a nice way to be able to potentially access and compare multiple program disclosure documents across multiple states. In addition, you'll see on the next slide, as I had mentioned before, the MSRB also engages in substantial education and outreach. And on our MSRB Education Center, you can access a host of information about ABLE programs, which will not only give you general information about the ABLE programs as a whole in hopefully pretty accessible and user-friendly language, but in addition can also explain to investors some of the investor protection rules that the MSRB has in place with respect to those programs, to the extent that there's a dealer or a municipal advisor involved. The last thing that I'd just like to mention from the MSRB's perspective is that we do have an investor protection and complaint rule in place, which is MSRB Rule G10. It applies equally to municipal advisors, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'll focus on it with respect to dealers. Essentially, this rule requires dealers to provide in writing to their customers certain information about the protections that are in place for those investors by directing them to an investor brochure. You can see the URL here to that investor brochure. It's going to be available on EMA, and again, this is intended to be a pretty simple, easy to access, and easy to dissect document that describes all of the basic investor protections that are in place, including with respect to investors in ABLE programs that are municipal securities. If you're concerned or you'd like to report a potential complaint about a financial professional, that investor brochure would also explain to which regulated entity you would be able to make that complaint. But in addition, you're always able to report any complaints to the MSRB. And we do have some information here about our contact phone number as well as our email. The MSRB does have a policy on potential rule violations where anytime a potential rule violation comes to our attention, even if it's not necessarily a violation of MSRB rules, we would make sure that we share that with any applicable any other regulator. So you're welcome to reach out to us at any time, even if you're not quite sure if a particular action is a rule violation, if it causes concern to you nonetheless. So on this last slide here, you see the MSRB's contact information. You're welcome to reach out to us at any point in time. You see here that we've got an MSRB support number. This will lead you to a call center where we've got a staff of very well-versed individuals that can assist you with any questions that you might have. To the extent that it's a more complicated legal question, we do have a subject matter expert here in both 529 college savings plans as well as ABLE programs, and certainly they can always get across any of those questions to her, and that she would make sure that she contacts you. So that's basic information about the MSRB and our role with respect to ABLE programs, and I'm happy whenever it's time for Q&A to take any possible questions.
Great, great. That's just some incredible information, Celia. We really appreciate you giving us an introduction to the MSRB, telling us a little bit about Emma and where we can find those disclosure documents, and how MSRB kind of, what it has to do with ABLE and protections. It is important, and I think you guys can play a critical role with respect that a lot of folks don't fully understand that these are, in fact, investment accounts as opposed to generic kind of FDIC savings accounts that you might open at your brick-and-mortar banking institution. And with that comes, responsibility and understanding risk and understanding things to make sure that the individual does not get taken advantage of. So we certainly appreciate all the information that you provided that can help ABLE account owners or potential ABLE account owners better understand their responsibilities as ABLE account owners and getting more comfortable in terms of making decisions related to the contributions that are made to their accounts. So I certainly appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and to share that information. Now I'd like to kind of switch it over, and we have some questions. We certainly want to bring in our guest panelists. But I want to start out with bringing in Juliana Christ, who is the director for the Ohio Stable Plan. We really wanted to make sure that we got Ohio into this conversation because they were, as I mentioned previously, the first state to launch an ABLE program. Since then, they continue to be a leader in the field. And as one of the responsibilities, I think, of being the first out of the gate, they were the first to actually publish an ABLE disclosure document before which had never been created or developed. So I am interested, number one, Juliana, just to tell us, if you could, a little bit about the Ohio Stable Program in general, and then take us through, y'all's process in terms of putting together the disclosure document, of which I don't think I'm overstepping by saying has been used quite extensively by other programs as kind of a template or a starting point to develop theirs. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that information with us, we'd be very grateful.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Like Chris said, my name is Juliana Christ. I am the director for Ohio's nationwide ABLE program, which we call Stable Accounts. I'll give you a couple quick points about our program in particular. As Chris mentioned, we were the first plan to get up and running in the country. We will take enrollments from anybody in any state. So even though we're based out of Ohio, we have people from all states across the country enrolled in our accounts. We're coming up on 2 years. So we actually opened the first account in our pilot program in April of 2016. Since then, we've been really fortunate to see great progress in these accounts. We're approaching 6,000 accounts across the country, and we've had our participants contribute over $30 million into our program. A couple details about it. As I mentioned, we're a nationwide program, but we also administer the ABLE plans for 11 other states. Those currently up and running, we run the plans for Kentucky, Vermont, Georgia, Missouri, South Carolina, New Hampshire, New Mexico, and West Virginia, and there are others coming soon. So folks in those states, you will see in our plan disclosure document, we speak to Ohio-specific tax and benefits laws, and we also speak to the tax and benefits laws for those partner states that we assist in running their program. So you can look for that in our disclosure document. Some things unique to our plan, you can check these out on our website, stableaccount.com. We offer 5 investment options, including one that is FDIC insured. So if you're a little hesitant about, quote-unquote investing or using mutual funds, that is a good option for people. It's our most popular option. A lot of people use that for to put their money in because it is insured and you won't lose on that one. We also have a prepaid debit card attached to our program that has a lot of boundary type rules that you can put around it for your loved one if you'd like to. A lot of our folks like to give their loved ones a great more deal of financial independence, but also want to have some monitoring on that. So we've put together a pretty unique option for people that want to be able to spend easily, but also be able to track what they're spending and monitor what their loved one is doing. We have, I think, the largest team in the country, too. I can brag on my people because I think they do a great job. We have 5 full-time staff just for the program in my office and a whole nother group of customer service folks. So anybody on the webinar, any questions that you have afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me in my office or our customer service team. We love helping people. We field questions all day long, so please feel free to do that. So that's kind of the overall of our program. We've grown to the largest program in the country. We're proud to be there, and we hope to keep growing in the coming years. So I'll speak a little bit to, Chris, your point about how did we even begin to put together this disclosure document. It was a tough process. We obviously were the first ones to do this, so it wasn't as though we had a template that we could copy and edit. So our process, essentially we started out with an attorney who worked in disclosure drafting, right? And he put together a first draft for us. As you can imagine, it was very technical, as it should be, but we really wanted to be mindful of the folks that would be reading this document and how digestible it would be for everybody. So we started out with this wonderful draft done by this group of attorneys, and then we passed it around to a bunch of non-attorneys, right, and asked them to really edit it. We asked them a lot of questions. Is this readable? Does it make sense? Is there a better way we can say this? Does it have to be so technical? Sometimes we succeeded in that endeavor, sometimes we didn't. It's still a legal document, so for the folks on the call, I won't lie, it's dense. There are a lot of things that we just have to say the way we say them. Some of it we can't even change. You know, some of the language about the investments, we just have to take it verbatim. So I beg your forgiveness for that. But we tried our very best to make it more accessible to people that weren't used to investments or didn't have a legal background, so that they could really use it as a one-stop shop for all of the rules about our program. So some other things that we took into account, we really wanted to make sure that it was not just readable in layman's terms, but also accessible. So simple things that you wouldn't normally think about, like the size of the document, the size of the font. When we looked at examples of disclosure documents from across the country, different programs, we saw a lot of, what I'll call fine print, right? Like 6-point font, 4-inch booklets, and we knew that wasn't going to work for us. So if you were to call and ask for a paper booklet today, you would get a sturdy, regular size 8.5 by 11 bound booklet, normal 12-point font, good spacing, good text, all of that. We also send this booklet, it's available electronically on our website. We send it out to an accessibility vendor, and we have it formatted, especially so that it works with browser readers for folks with visual disabilities. So that's something we took really seriously. We wanted to make sure that worked for our folks. After the fact, we solicited feedback. I know Chris's team, the folks at the Able National Resource Center, even gave us some initial feedback, and we're continuing to edit it. So we always like to get feedback. If anybody out there has questions or comments on it, please send them to me. We'd love to hear them. And we can always, I'm sure we can always be better in all the things that we do. But the goal of it is just to be the one place where you can have all of the rules that affect all of the account holders that we have in our program. So everything from what the fees are, which Chris mentioned, to little things like what's the cutoff for getting in your 2018 contributions, right? Do you have to have it postmarked by a certain date or electronically submitted by a certain date? Even those really nitty-gritty rules we put into our booklet. So that's an overview. I'll stop there, Chris, but that's the process that we went through, and we're constantly updating the document. Even now we're doing a major overhaul to accommodate all of the tax changes that have happened this year.
Right, right. Well, we certainly appreciate all the consideration that you guys took in creating the document. As you mentioned, we were very happy that you guys solicited our input and recommendations, and of course, I know that it was an extensive process to make sure it was accessible in the most appropriate form possible so that folks can feel comfortable and understand what they're getting into. I think based on what you said, I know as we talked about in our previous webinar a month ago, there are a lot of changes going on related to ABLE, and I would expect they would require some changing and some edits in that document. Now, when those changes take place, how do you alert folks, or is there, should they check back periodically to look at changes or revisions, or how does that work?
No, so they don't have to do anything or look for anything. We alert them. So the first step for any changes to the program always goes on our website, because we can put that stuff, change stuff on the website in real time, right? If some tax rule changed today, we could go in and change the website. Of course, we can't change a printed booklet right away. So you will sometimes see a lag time between what shows up on our website and details in the plan disclosure, but for all of our account holders, if we change the plan disclosure or we update it, we will either send it to them electronically, if that's how they've chosen to receive their documents, or we will mail them out a hard copy if they elect to receive hard copy documents.
Excellent, excellent. And then I know that you guys get, all kinds of questions related to ABLE in general, or maybe more specific questions related to your program. We get a ton of them, obviously, here at the ABLE National Resource Center through various platforms. And, of course, the majority of them are answerable within these disclosure documents. Are there kind of a top 3 that you could think of questions that you get that you know that are really well explained in the disclosure document?
Yeah, so I would say for sure information about our investment options. A lot of our folks haven't, maybe have had a bank account in the past, but this will be their first time picking an investment. So we have our own descriptions that we've put, and this is pages and pages in the document, so our own descriptions that we've drafted, and then we've also included appendices that we got from the actual investment managers. So every single one of our investment options has its own appendix in there, and it just really kind of breaks down for you how risky that particular option is, what the fees on it are, whether or not it's a good thing for a short, someone that has a short time horizon or a long time horizon. So that's a big one. The other thing I would say is benefits treatment, right? So how does this actually interact with our benefits? And so we have a lot of good stuff on there on SSI in particular. We drafted several specific examples, because I think those are often easier to work through than just copying and pasting legal text. So good examples, real-life examples that we've gotten are in the document, too, to help people work through benefits questions.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I want everybody on the phone to understand, or everybody on the webinar to understand that these disclosure documents are so much more than just dense text, although there is this dense text involved. But the ones that I've looked through, and of which I think I've probably at least went through the majority of them, you guys do such a great job of putting things out in charts, especially around the investment options, and creating hypotheticals and creating examples to try and help people fully understand that particular part of the disclosure document. And a lot of that is, like you said, Juliana, around making people feel comfortable with their investment options and recognizing under what circumstances might one be better suited for an individual than another. So I certainly appreciate that, and I would encourage folks, because I suspect most people don't look at that document, to check it out, because it is, I think, because of the work that's been done by these programs, certainly by the Ohio Stable program, it's a lot more digestible than people probably think when they hear the term, quote unquote, disclosure document. So I think those are great points. I do want to work in, and I know we have Michael, our executive director, here, a couple of questions, or at least as many questions as we can actually, from the audience that's been submitting questions over the last hour or so. So Michael, I know that you had pointed out a couple.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. We'll just pick some at random. A question came in. I believe ABLE is not available to residents in Wisconsin. Is that correct? What is the typical fee for ABLE-eligible individuals from Wisconsin to seek out as non-residents to join a ABLE program in another state? So I can take the first part of that is Wisconsin took the unusual path of not creating an ABLE program, but providing on their state income tax a deduction of up to the dollar amount for a person contributing to an out-of-state ABLE account, which now in 2018 is $15,000 if one person did it, or if they contributed part of it, $3,000, then it would be a $3,000 deduction on their Wisconsin income tax. Is there a typical fee for non-residents? I don't know that there's a typical fee. I think you'd want to, again, look at disclosure statements and visit websites because you really have two types of fees. You have kind of a administrative maintenance fee for opening an account and for the back and forth information you're going to get from a state ABLE program. But then there are also fees related to the savings or investment choice that you make. So there are two types of fees, and you would have to read closely. Some states do have more fees than others, and I don't know if I could say more on that. So let me go to another question. If my son is an adult, can I still fill out the paperwork or go online and help him submit to open an ABLE account? And the answer to that would be absolutely. Anyone could help someone open an ABLE account, but that ABLE account is going to be in his name, but you do have those other options in terms of a power of attorney or guardianship in terms of who overall is going to make decisions about the withdrawal of funds from that ABLE account. Does the application need to be done through the mail, or can it be done online? And in fact, I believe every state that has opened offers an electronic application. Not all states offer a mail option, so it's actually kind of the reverse of that. Are the annual contributions to the ABLE account taxable to the beneficiary? No, the annual contributions in terms of federal tax, the money going in, is dependent on who put the money in. If the beneficiary put the money in, it's their money, then it's taxable, depending on what tax rate that they're in. If the money was put by others, it would be taxable to them. However, many states have state income tax deductions, as I just mentioned, Wisconsin being the most unusual. So you would have to look carefully at that choice, and it is the reason many people select their own state ABLE account option because they're going to get a state income tax deduction, but you would have to weigh state income tax deduction versus fee structure. And each state has a state income tax deduction, has it set at different levels. I believe Wisconsin is the only one that has it up to the full amount of $15,000.
Yeah, I would also add that all dollars contributed into any ABLE account are to be post-tax dollars. So it's not like an individual contributing into their, say, retirement fund where it's pre-taxed. All contributions are post-tax dollars, but as Michael said, some states offer state income tax deductions or credits associated with contributions made. However, there's no federal income tax deductions or contributions attributed to contributions made into an ABLE account.
Another question was, since ABLE accounts are investment accounts, are they federally insured? And maybe I'll turn back to the MSRB to answer that question.
So if they're federally insured, the answer is no. That's the basic question. They are investment accounts. So again, you would want to make sure that you're carefully reviewing their program disclosure documents, and that you're fully understanding what the investment options are and that what you're getting yourself into if you do in fact invest in a particular program.
I would just clarify, this is Juliana in Ohio. We do have one of our investment portfolios that is FDIC insured. It's not a mutual fund, so that one actually is insured.
Right.
Thanks,
yeah,
thanks
and
for
if
the
you could expand,
clarification.
I was just about to ask just some clarification so that folks know that there is this FDIC insured option in most, I don't know if I can say all ABLE programs at this point, but it's been widely adopted to allow folks for this option. Can you take us through a little bit, Juliana, what the motivation was to offer this particular option?
Sure. So we knew about that we were going to have people saving for long-term and people who would really want to use their ABLE account more as like a checking account, so to pay for day-to-day expenses. So for those people, obviously, it doesn't make sense for them to put their money in, you know, a really aggressive, kind of risky stock market option. They don't want to be worried about potentially losing money in the short term. So we knew that this was critical, and about 40% of our contributions go into this option. So it's far and away our most popular option for those people who are really, you know, using this more as a day-to-day spending tool.
Great. There was a question that came in. Do the disclosure documents identify the specific qualified disability expenses that are allowable? And Juliana, you may want to go ahead and answer that.
Sure. So what we have is in our disclosure, we do identify the broad categories that the IRS has indicated are qualified disability expenses. Some of them, though, are broad. So, for example, basic living expenses is a qualified disability expense. There's a lot of stuff that can fall into that. So there's no one exhaustive list of every single thing that could be considered a basic living expense. So just keep that in mind, but we do have the broad categories, you know, medical expenses, legal expenses, living expenses, housing and rent. We do have a lot of those overarching categories on there.
Okay. Several questions again about qualified disability expenses. Just, I guess, a clarification was stated that burial expenses are a qualified disability expense and could be paid before Medicaid can draw from on the account in terms of Medicaid Payback. And that is true. That's a qualified disability expense, burial expenses, as are benefits planning, legal expenses, so many other, financial planning, so many other categories. Another question was, when I open an ABLE account, is there any reason, this is interesting, is there any reason why I would still want to have a savings account with a financial institution that is federally insured? And again, maybe to Ohio, how do you answer that question?
So the answer is you might. Yeah, it just depends on the person's individual circumstances. If you're more, if you're used to going into a brick and mortar store, taking out cash, writing checks, for that reason, yeah, you would want to have a savings account in addition. I think ABLE accounts work really well in tandem with a lot of other financial tools, like regular bank accounts, like special needs trusts. So we see ourselves as complementary to all of those existing options.
And that leads right into another question, which is, I have a special needs trust. Why would there be a reason for me to have an ABLE account? I don't understand the benefit.
So I
great
can start
question.
out with that one.
Sorry. Yeah.
Chris might start, and then we'll go back to you.
Yeah. So this is a great question. We get this question pretty often, and before going into great detail, I would encourage folks to go to the ABLE National Resource Center website, and under webinars, I think we've done at least one, maybe two webinars specifically just dedicated 90 minutes just on understanding the differences of a special needs trust and an ABLE account, and perhaps more importantly, how they can actually work together. But just to point out a couple, oftentimes the cost associated with setting up a special needs trust is much greater than the financial cost of establishing and maintaining an ABLE account. One of the things that I think makes ABLE really, really special and very much more progressive perhaps is the fact that ABLE accounts, the beneficiary is the account owner, and those funds belong to them. It allows them much greater autonomy and independence over those funds than is allowed in something like a pooled trust or a third-party trust wherein you're not the owner of the account, but you're the beneficiary of the account. But then you have, other pros and cons. Again, you can only put up to $15,000 worth of contributions into an ABLE account, whereas a special needs trust, you can dump an incredible amount of money into it. On the other side, ABLE accounts grow tax-free, whereas special needs trusts are taxed at a fairly high rate. Those are just a few. Again, I would encourage folks, if they're interested in hearing more detail about that, go to the ABLE National Resource Center and go to the archived webinars and check that out. I don't know, Juliana, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, the big thing we always mention is that, with a special needs trust, you can't use that money to pay rent, to buy a house, mortgage. Yeah. You can use your ABLE account for that. And it's just ease of administration. So you don't have to go to your trustee and ask for permission. It's your money, right? You can wake up in the morning, decide you need to go to the grocery store, and just go to the grocery store. Take your debit card. You don't have to go to court. You don't have to file budgets. It's just a little bit easier to access, and the ownership is great.
Yeah.
Here's a question we also get quite frequently, is trying to understand state benefits. So if I open an ABLE account in another state, does that state affect my benefits in my home state? Juliana, I don't know if you probably can answer that too.
Sure. So it won't affect your federal benefits. It doesn't matter where you open your ABLE account.
Right.
It's not going to affect your Medicaid or your SSI or your SNAP or anything like that. Whether or not it affects your state-level benefits, so that would just be like if your state has a specific program that just they run, that would be determined by your state law. So you'd need to check with your state benefits agency to ask them about that.
Right. And some states, with their legislation to create the ABLE program, specifically extended the not counting an ABLE account as a resource related to federal benefits. They did extend it to a variety of state benefits, but you really have to check, excuse me, state by state. Let's see. You would figure this question: which state has the best non-resident options in terms of the least amount of fees? Well, we will tell you on the ABLE National Resource Center, we provide you information to all state programs that are open, including the District of Columbia, but we are not going to, in any way, other than provide facts, recommend to anyone individually, this state is right for you over another state program. Some states have done more marketing to propose that they have the lowest fees, but this is a dynamic marketplace, and new programs have been opening regularly. I say to most people, check your state to see if your state has a program, because there may be certain benefits or that would accrue to you before you look at other state programs. But then the next thing you want to look at is how do those benefits compare to what may be the fee structure of another state program that charges non-residents more money than they charge residents of their state who are ABLE eligible. It's not a simple question to answer, but you want to take the time to do some comparison The tool on the ABLE website can help you at least compare 3 state programs at a time, but there are many more than 3 programs now, and we're looking at how we can revise the tool to put in front of someone more states at the same time. Okay. The question is asked, what are examples of non-eligible withdrawals? And the best answer to that is anything that is illegal would be a non-eligible withdrawal. What do I mean by that? Paying for, what's illegal? Paying for gambling, it depends on the state and where you're located. I know when we work with Treasury on the proposed rules, we worked really hard to not only have these categories of big buckets that are qualified disability expenses, but to also make it very clear that this is not a medical necessity test, as is done with reimbursement by Medicaid, and it also is not the test often used by Medicaid, which is that the expense is for the exclusive use of the individual with a disability. Right. So, you know, it is, if it's going to help improve your health, your independence, your productivity, your well-being, you're probably on the right side of this.
Right. I would also add, and I'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone on this one. It has to have some predominant benefit for the beneficiary. So as an example, my brother has an ABLE account. He lives in Texas. It's my mom's birthday today. Happy birthday, Mom. But he cannot use his funds in his ABLE account to buy my mom a birthday present, right? Because it's not for his benefit. That would be a non-qualified expense of which he would be subject to a tax penalty and consequences. And those funds, you know, per se that he did that, however much money that costs, could be counted against him for his eligibility for his Medicaid and SSI. So,
and it might be worth mentioning, and Juliana, you could amplify on this, you as the state program managers and administrators, you are not determining whether an expense is a qualified disability expense. The individual is going to certify on their tax return if they have an ABLE account, did any money get dispersed, and explain that those disability expenses were qualified. It will take the random audit by the IRS, selecting one of thousands, to do a further background check and perhaps may ask more questions. But am I correct, Juliana? I don't think you're in any way certifying expenses qualified or second guessing a account owner and beneficiary about what they're expending money on.
That's correct. The authority for that lies with, as you said, Michael, the IRS. So we don't ask people what you're spending your money on. You don't have to account to us. We do offer some tools just for their own personal benefit that can help them track what they're spending, just for personal record keeping. But we don't ask those questions, and that oversight does not lie with us.
Right. Okay. Let's see if I can take one more. Let's see. I'm trying to find ones that are more broadly applicable. Yeah, one question did come in, and this comes out pretty regularly. What if I'm not a parent, but I'm a sibling? Can I be designated with the administrative power outside of power of attorney to help my brother or sister who is ABLE eligible take over the responsibility for managing the account and exercising the authority to move money out of the account for qualified disability expenses? The person goes on further is, my parents are dead, they're no longer alive. I have 6 siblings, but my understanding is siblings outside of power of attorney cannot be designated with the administrative power. Maybe that's a question, I guess, again, Juliana, how would you answer that?
So he is correct. The question is correct. You could do it if you had guardianship, though, over your sibling.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's just something that the federal law leaves us with. We don't have a lot of control over that. If you don't have power of attorney and you're not the parent, you would have to have guardianship.
All right. I think that pretty much wraps us up. It is 3:30. Again, I want to thank the MSRB and Ms. Olgan for taking her time to give us some great information, and certainly Ms. Chris from Ohio. I want to say thank you for giving your expertise and your insight. Again, I know that we noted a lot of the tools on the ABLE National Resource Center and a lot of the information on there. So the website is up there on the screen right now, www.ablenrc.org. We encourage folks to go there. Please sign up for our ABLE newsletter. We're now publishing that once a month with all the ABLE-related information, including upcoming webinars and things of that sort, new publications, launch programs. We will be doing webinars once a month. This year it'll be the 4th Thursday of every month, so stay tuned for that. And with that, if you ever have any other questions, my contact information is on the screen. You're also able to give us a ring or submit questions via the website. Until next time, everybody, have a great day. Bye-bye.